Thomas Hale lived alone on a quiet piece of land far out on the Texas frontier. His days were usually simple and slow, shaped by the rhythm of the sun and the needs of his cattle. He was not the kind of man who looked for excitement or trouble. He enjoyed peaceful mornings, the soft sound of wind moving across the grass, and the comfort of familiar work. Life was steady, and he liked it that way. One warm afternoon, Thomas was riding along a stretch of land he rarely visited. The summer heat had dried the creek beds, leaving behind long lines of cracked earth. He didn't expect to find anything unusual there. Most days, he only checked for lost cattle or broken fences. That day, however, something caught his eye. Something small and still lying near the edge of the dry creek. At first, he thought it must be an animal. Maybe a calf or a deer resting in the shade. But as he rode closer, he felt a strange pull in his chest. The shape didn't move at all, not even when the sound of his horse approached. Thomas slowed down, unsure of what he was looking at. When he finally came close enough, he realized it was not an animal at all. It was a young girl. She looked very young, perhaps 12 years old. Her clothes were made of soft leather and beaded patterns, unlike anything settlers usually wore. Her long, dark hair fell over her face, and she lay curled on her side as if she had collapsed from exhaustion. She looked peaceful but troubled at the same time, as though she had tried hard to keep moving before her strength finally failed her. Thomas slipped off his horse and crouched beside her. He called out gently, but she did not answer. Her breathing was faint, and she looked extremely tired and thirsty. She didn't appear hurt from any struggle. Instead, she seemed to have been traveling for a long time and simply couldn't go any farther. Thomas felt a wave of concern rise inside him. She was Comanche, and he understood the risk that came with that. The Comanche people protected their own, and misunderstandings were easy on the frontier. If her family or tribe found her on his ranch, they might think he meant harm. But looking at her small frame and her weak breathing, Thomas knew he couldn't leave her there. The decision weighed on him for a moment. The land around him was silent, as if waiting for him to decide. He looked up at the sky. Not a single cloud offered shade from the heat. If he walked away now, she might not survive the afternoon. Thomas let out a slow breath, understanding that his choice could bring danger to his doorstep. But he also knew that turning away from someone in need would stay on his conscience forever. He placed his hands carefully under the girl's shoulders and lifted her gently. She stirred a little, as if waking from a dream, but her eyes remained closed. Thomas spoke softly, telling her she was safe and that he was only trying to help. He carried her to his horse, settling her in front of him so she wouldn't fall. Then he headed toward his ranch, guiding the horse slowly to keep her comfortable. The ride home felt longer than usual. Thomas kept glancing down at the girl, hoping she would wake and speak. He thought about who she might be. Someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who belonged to a family that must be searching for her. He worried about what might have happened to her people, and whether they were nearby right now. Every sound on the wind made him turn his head, expecting to see riders in the distance. But the hills stayed quiet, and no one appeared. When he reached his small ranch house, he lifted her carefully and carried her inside. The room was simple: a wooden table, a stove, a bed pushed against the wall. He laid her gently on the bed, then hurried to bring water. Her lips were dry, and her breathing still shallow. Thomas dipped a cloth in the cool water and touched it lightly to her forehead. After a few moments, she blinked her eyes open. She looked frightened at first. Her eyes darted around the room, then to him. Thomas raised his hands a little to show he meant no harm. He spoke softly, telling her she was safe. The girl seemed unsure. But she didn't try to run or pull away. When he offered her a small sip of water, she accepted it. Her hands trembled slightly and she drank slowly, as if even that took effort. Thomas watched her with careful respect. He didn't ask questions, knowing she might not understand him or feel ready to speak. Instead, he focused on keeping her calm. He brought a blanket and covered her lightly, hoping she felt secure. She watched him with thoughtful, cautious eyes, trying to understand him. As the hours passed, she rested quietly while Thomas checked on his animals. Each time he returned to the room, she seemed a little more aware of her surroundings. At sunset, she sat up slightly, and he noticed her eyes soften just a little. When he pointed to himself and said, "Thomas," she repeated the sound softly, her voice thin but clear. A small moment of trust passed between them. When she pointed to herself, she said a name. "Ayanna." Thomas smiled gently, repeating it back to her so she knew he had understood. Ayanna relaxed a little, her shoulders dropping from the tense position she had held earlier. Although she was still weak, she seemed comforted knowing he wasn't trying to harm her. Thomas prepared a simple meal for her, something easy to digest. She ate slowly but gratefully. Afterward, she lay back down, closing her eyes as though her body needed more rest than she could fight. Outside, the sky darkened. The stars began to shine over the open land. Thomas stood at the door, looking out toward the horizon. He felt a mixture of worry and responsibility. He wondered if her people were close. He wondered if they had seen him bring her home. He knew that helping her was the right thing to do, but the thought of misunderstanding still troubled him. Later, he sat beside the small window where he could watch the night sky. The quiet of the ranch felt heavier than usual. Every so often, he heard Ayanna shift in the bed, and he would glance back to make sure she was comfortable. She never cried out. She only moved softly, as though dreaming. Thomas thought about the many stories he had heard about the Comanche. Some settlers spoke of them with fear, while others said they were strong, proud people who cared deeply for their families. Thomas believed the second view. He had never wanted conflict with anyone. He simply wanted to live peacefully on his land. And now, with a young girl resting in his home, he hoped that peace could continue. Before going to sleep, he checked on Ayanna one last time. She was breathing more evenly now, her face relaxed instead of tense. He adjusted the blanket around her shoulders and spoke quietly, reassuring her even if she couldn't fully understand the words. Thomas blew out the lamp and lay down on his own bed across the room. For a long time he stayed awake, listening to the sounds of the night. The wind outside rustled the grass gently, and somewhere far away, an owl called out. Thomas wondered what the next day would bring. Would Ayanna be strong enough to speak more? Would she remember how she ended up alone? Would her people come searching for her? The questions circled in his mind as he drifted slowly into sleep. Outside, the land rested under the cover of darkness, calm and still. But somewhere beyond the hills, beyond the tall grasses and quiet plains, there were people who must be looking for a girl named Ayanna, people who cared for her, people who would not stop until they found her. Thomas did not know it yet, but his act of kindness had already begun a chain of events that would lead him into one of the most unexpected moments of his life. Everything was quiet for now, but the silence of the frontier often hid the footsteps of tomorrow. And tomorrow, things would begin to change. The next morning began with soft sunlight spilling through the small window of Thomas Hale's cabin. The golden rays touched the wooden floor and slowly reached the bed where Ayanna lay. For a moment, Thomas forgot everything that happened the day before. He simply stood outside, breathing in the cool morning air, listening to the wind brushing through the grass. But then he remembered the quiet presence inside his home, and he stepped back in gently to check on her. Ayanna was awake but lying very still, watching the room with calm but cautious eyes. She noticed Thomas enter, and didn't shrink away the way she had when she first woke up the previous night. Her expression was curious this time, as though she was still trying to understand where she was and who he truly was. Thomas offered her a small smile. He picked up the cup of water he had left on the table and slowly walked toward her, careful not to startle her. When he handed it to her, Ayanna accepted it quietly. She brought the cup to her lips and took small sips, her hands steadier than the night before. It was a small improvement, but an important one. After she drank, he asked softly if she was feeling better. Even if she didn't fully understand his words, his tone was gentle. Ayanna nodded slightly, touching her hand to her chest, and then giving a small gesture as if to say she felt stronger today. That simple gesture brought relief to Thomas. It meant she was recovering. He prepared a simple breakfast of warm bread, vegetables, and a bit of broth. Ayanna ate slowly, observing his movements each time he walked past. It was as if she was studying him, trying to discover whether he was truly someone she could trust. Thomas didn't rush her. He let her take her time and simply went about his morning duties. Throughout the morning, she watched him fix the fire, fetch water, and check his tools. Sometimes she shifted the blanket slightly or sat up a little straighter, testing her strength. Every now and then, she glanced toward the window, her eyes lingering on the open land outside, perhaps wondering how far she was from her family. When Thomas stepped outside to check on his animals, he left the door slightly open so she wouldn't feel trapped. He moved quietly, not wanting to overwhelm her with noise. As he walked around the ranch, he thought about the day ahead. He needed to figure out how to help her find her people safely. But until she was fully recovered, he couldn't make any final decision. Later that day, when he returned to the house, he found Ayanna sitting up on the bed. She was touching a string of beads around her wrist. The beads were colorful, arranged in a pattern that clearly meant something to her. When she noticed Thomas watching, she looked down quickly, as if embarrassed. But Thomas only smiled and nodded gently. He knew the beads were special to her, a part of her life, her culture, and her family. He sat on a stool a few feet away, trying not to make her uncomfortable. He pointed at himself and repeated, "Thomas," hoping to reinforce the name. She repeated it quietly, this time with a little more confidence. Then she pointed to herself and said, "Ayanna," just as she had the night before. Thomas nodded warmly. Their names were their first shared bridge, a simple connection between two very different worlds. As the day went on, Ayanna slowly began to move around the small cabin. She didn't walk far, only a few steps from the bed to the table, but each step showed she was gaining strength. Thomas stayed nearby, offering a hand if she needed support, but she seemed proud to try on her own. He respected that pride and didn't force help on her unless she showed she wanted it. Later in the afternoon, she stood near the window, watching the open land. Her expression was thoughtful, almost longing. She lifted her hand and pointed toward the distant hills. Thomas understood what she meant. She was thinking about her home, her family, the people who must be looking for her. He nodded again, reassuring her that he would try to help her return when she was strong enough. Ayanna looked relieved and turned back toward him with a soft, grateful expression. Even though they barely shared the same language, a sense of trust was beginning to form. Slow, careful, but real. As the days passed, the connection between them grew. Each morning, Thomas found her sitting up a little straighter. She began helping him with small tasks inside the house, passing him a cloth, arranging items on the table, handing him tools. These gestures were simple, but they showed she felt safe enough to participate in the life around her. In return, Thomas tried to learn more about her. Sometimes she drew small pictures in the dirt outside the house, circles, lines, shapes. From her drawings, he guessed she was trying to show him places she remembered. A wide circle might be her family's camp. A winding line might be a river or trail she traveled. Thomas studied each drawing carefully, hoping to understand where she belonged. One afternoon, Ayanna drew a small cluster of shapes that looked like tents or lodges. Then she pointed toward the north. Thomas realized she was showing him the direction of her people. It was a big step. It meant she didn't fear him anymore, not the way she had in the beginning. She was willing to share her world with him. But trust was still fragile. Whenever she heard a sudden sound, like a horse neighing or a door creaking, she would react quickly, her eyes alert. Thomas always spoke softly in those moments, telling her everything was fine. He knew she lived in a world where caution kept people safe. He wanted her to feel secure in his home, even if her heart was still tied to the land beyond his ranch. During the evenings, they sat quietly near the small fire. Thomas would carve wood or repair tools, while Ayanna rested with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Sometimes she hummed a soft tune, a soothing sound that filled the cabin with warmth. Her voice was gentle, like a memory she was trying to hold on to. Thomas didn't understand the song, but he appreciated the calm it brought. The trust between them grew even more when Thomas allowed her to step outside for short walks. At first, she was hesitant, staying close to the cabin, but slowly she ventured farther, only a few steps, then several yards. Thomas watched from a distance, making sure she didn't tire herself out. Ayanna would look back at him often, checking if it was safe to continue. Each time, he nodded gently. One morning, something new appeared on the horizon. Thin lines of smoke rising in the distance. Ayanna saw it before Thomas did. She stepped outside and stared at it, her eyes wide with recognition. Thomas followed her gaze and felt his stomach tighten. It was not the smoke from any settler's chimney. It rose too far, too high, in a pattern he knew belonged to the Comanche people. Ayanna turned to him and pointed, her expression serious. She was trying to tell him that her people were nearby. Thomas felt a wave of mixed emotions wash over him. On one hand, he was relieved. He wanted her to reunite with her family. On the other hand, he knew misunderstandings could happen easily. If the Comanche found her here, they might think she had been taken. He needed to make sure her return was safe and peaceful. For the next 2 days, the smoke signals continued to appear. Ayanna watched them every morning and evening. She seemed more alert, more hopeful. Her strength was nearly restored now, and she walked with more confidence. Thomas knew it was time to think about bringing her back. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and painted the sky with soft orange light, Ayanna approached him. She touched her hand to her heart and then pointed toward the north again. Her meaning was clear. She was ready to go home. Thomas nodded slowly. He knew what he had to do. He would escort her toward the place she belonged. It was the right thing to do, even if it filled him with worry. He didn't want trouble. He only wanted her to be safe. Ayanna's eyes softened, full of trust and gratitude. She seemed to understand the weight of his decision. For a moment, silence settled between them, a gentle, meaningful silence that needed no words. By nightfall, Thomas began preparing supplies for the journey: water, food, blankets. Ayanna helped quietly, handing him items and organizing the things they would need. Despite the quiet tension beneath the surface, the atmosphere felt peaceful, almost hopeful. They didn't know what awaited them beyond the ranch. They didn't know who they would meet or how things would unfold. But they both understood that the bond they had built in those few days, fragile, quiet, yet deeply human, would guide them forward. The next morning, they would begin their journey toward her people, not knowing that something far greater awaited them, something neither of them could have imagined. Their path was about to lead them into the heart of a moment that would test courage, trust, and the strength of the silent friendship they had formed. The morning of their departure arrived with a pale blue sky and a quiet stillness that felt almost thoughtful. Thomas Hale stepped outside while the sun was still low. letting the cool air wake him fully. The land around him was calm, but underneath that calm he felt a soft tension, the kind that comes before a journey into the unknown. Inside the cabin, Ayanna was already awake. She sat near the small table, her blanket folded neatly beside her, waiting patiently for Thomas to prepare. She had recovered well over the past few days. Her steps were steadier now, her voice stronger when she spoke her short words in English or pointed to things to show him what she meant. Thomas could see the spark of energy returning to her, and he was glad. He had grown used to her presence in the house, the quiet way she watched everything, the soft tunes she sometimes hummed in the evenings. But he also knew this was not her true home, her real world, her family, her people. They were somewhere beyond the hills, waiting. As he tightened the straps on his horse's saddle, he kept glancing back at her. She stood near the doorway, looking out at the open land with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Her hair moved softly in the morning breeze, and for a moment, Thomas wondered what thoughts filled her young mind. Was she excited to return? Worried? Did she wonder whether her family was safe? Whatever she felt, she carried it quietly, with the calm dignity that seemed natural to her. Once the horse was ready, Thomas secured the small bundle of supplies they had prepared the night before. Water, food, blankets, simple tools. He then motioned for Ayanna to join him. She approached slowly, her eyes focused on the wide horizon as if trying to find familiar shapes or places from her memory. Thomas helped her onto the horse, making sure she was seated comfortably, and then climbed up behind her. He held the reins loosely, giving the horse a gentle nudge. The journey had begun. The first hour of travel passed in almost complete silence, the only sounds being the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the whisper of the wind brushing across the tall grass. Ayanna looked around constantly, her eyes scanning the land as if searching for signs of her people. Thomas watched her carefully, trying to understand the world through her gaze. Every time she pointed toward a distant hill or a group of trees, he shifted their direction slightly. He trusted her sense of the land more than his own. The land changed slowly as they moved. The flat plains gave way to gentle rises and rocky stretches. Birds flew overhead in smooth patterns, calling out to one another across the open sky. Every now and then, Ayanna would point excitedly at an animal, a rabbit darting into a bush, a deer grazing quietly, or a hawk circling high above. Her face lit up with recognition, as if she had seen these things many times before in her life with her people. Throughout the day, Thomas and Ayanna continued their cautious progress. They stopped to rest near a cluster of trees, where the shade felt cool and comforting. Ayanna sat on the soft grass while Thomas fetched water for the horse. When he returned, he found her drawing shapes in the dirt with a small stick. This time, the drawings looked clearer: mountains, a river, and a large open space that looked like a gathering area. She pointed to each shape gently, then gestured toward the north again. "You remember this?" Thomas asked softly. She nodded firmly, touching the drawing and then placing her hand over her heart. It was clear she knew the path. She hadn't forgotten the world she belonged to. They shared a small meal before continuing onward. As they traveled, Ayanna began to speak more in her soft voice, pointing to hills and naming them in her language. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he listened carefully, repeating the sounds she taught him. Sometimes she laughed quietly when he mispronounced a word, covering her mouth politely as if she didn't want to appear rude. That small laugh lightened the mood and reminded Thomas how young she really was. Despite everything, she still carried a child's warmth inside her. The sun climbed higher as the day went on. The air grew warmer, and the shadows shortened. They stopped again near a small stream, where Ayanna dipped her hands in the cool water and splashed her face. Thomas filled their containers and let the horse drink freely. They rested under the shade of a tall cottonwood tree. Ayanna leaned against the trunk, her eyes half closed, enjoying the stillness. While they rested, Thomas thought about the journey ahead. He hoped they would find her people soon, but he also knew the land was wide and unpredictable. He didn't want to wander too far into unfamiliar territory without being certain. He glanced at Ayanna, who was now watching the flowing stream with a peaceful expression. She seemed confident in the path they were taking. Her calmness gave him reassurance. After the break, they continued traveling until the sun began to lower in the sky. The light turned golden, casting long shadows across the ground. Ayanna pointed again toward the north, more confidently this time. Her gestures were clear, steady, and full of direction. Thomas felt they were getting closer. They found a flat area surrounded by short shrubs, a quiet place to rest for the night. Thomas helped Ayanna down from the horse, and together they set up a simple campsite. He lit a small fire, just enough to keep the evening chill away. Ayanna sat close to it, warming her hands. She hummed another soft tune, gentle, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby. Thomas listened quietly, letting the calm melody fill the evening air. When darkness settled, the stars brightened above them, stretching across the sky like countless tiny lanterns. Ayanna looked up at them with wonder, as if each star reminded her of something familiar. Thomas lay back on his blanket, staring at the same sky, feeling a strange sense of peace. Even though they were far from home, even though uncertainty waited ahead, the night felt safe. The next morning they began their journey early again. The land grew more rugged, with scattered rocks and tall hills rising in the distance. As they approached one of the hill ridges, Ayanna tensed slightly, her eyes scanning the ground. She leaned forward and touched Thomas's arm gently, signaling him to stop. He slowed the horse and looked where she pointed. There, in the soft dirt, were clear marks, shallow impressions spaced evenly apart. They looked like tracks from several horses passing through recently. Ayanna examined them closely, her eyes narrowing in recognition. She pointed to the tracks, then placed her hand over her heart again. Thomas understood exactly what she meant. These were the signs of her people. His chest tightened with a mixture of relief and caution. It meant they were on the right path, but it also meant they were now very close. Ayanna stood quietly beside him, her eyes full of hope. She seemed certain they would find her family soon. They followed the tracks carefully, moving slowly and staying alert. The trail curved around a rocky rise, then continued along a narrow valley. The land grew quieter as they traveled deeper between the hills. Even the wind sounded softer, almost as if it were holding its breath. Then, without warning, Ayanna lifted her hand quickly. Her expression changed, alert, focused, almost expectant. Thomas felt his heart beat a little faster. He listened. At first, he heard nothing, but after a few moments a faint sound reached him from far away. It was the rhythmic beat of hooves, steady and numerous, approaching from beyond the bend in the valley. Ayanna turned to him, her eyes wide but not fearful. She seemed to know exactly what the sound meant. Thomas took a slow breath. He didn't move suddenly or reach for anything. He simply straightened his posture and waited, knowing that the moment they had been moving toward was finally here. The sound grew louder. The echo of hooves filled the narrow valley, bouncing between the rocky walls. Dust began to rise in the distance. Ayanna stepped forward, her small figure standing tall despite her youth. She looked confident, as though she trusted the moment completely. And then they appeared. Horse after horse came into view, moving in a strong, steady line. The riders were dressed in traditional clothing, their posture upright and their horses well-trained. Their presence filled the valley with energy. Thomas counted quickly in his mind, but lost track after a while. There were many, far more than he expected. They spread out along the narrow space, forming a wide shape around him and Ayanna. Ayanna took a slow step forward, lifting her hand gently in a peaceful gesture. She wasn't afraid. Instead, she seemed almost relieved, as if the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. Thomas stayed completely still, his breath calm, not wanting to cause confusion. He looked at Ayanna, who glanced back at him with soft reassurance, as if telling him silently that everything would be all right. What lay ahead in the next few moments would shape everything that followed. The moment of meeting, the moment of being seen by her people, the moment when all misunderstandings had to remain quiet. These were the delicate seconds that would decide the path of the story. Ayanna turned back toward the riders, with hope shining in her eyes. And then, the group of nearly 50 warriors slowed their horses, surrounding the valley in a wide circle of curious, watchful faces, all trying to understand the sight before them. Their arrival marked the beginning of a moment neither Thomas nor Ayanna would ever forget. The night was calm, but Jacob could not sleep. The small cabin felt too quiet after everything that had happened. The girl, whom he now knew as Naya, slept peacefully on the bed he had set up for her. Her breathing had grown steady, and her face finally relaxed, no longer tight with pain or fear. Jacob sat near the dim lantern, replaying the events of the day in his mind. The moment he found her, the arrival of the warriors, the tense standoff, and the sudden change that followed. It felt unreal, almost like a story someone else had lived. But it was real, and he could feel the truth of it in his tired bones. Outside, the wind brushed against the wooden walls of the cabin as if trying to whisper something. Jacob got up and stepped outside. The moonlight spread across the dry land, lighting up the grass and quiet hills. The horses of the warriors were tied not far away, their silhouettes blending into the night. The warriors themselves had set up small fires around the area, forming a loose circle around the ranch. It was unusual, Jacob thought. He had never imagined a night where Comanche warriors would camp peacefully around his home. He walked a little further and found Lone Hawk standing near a small fire, sharpening a wooden tool with slow, calm movements. Lone Hawk nodded respectfully when he saw Jacob approaching. For a moment, neither man spoke. They simply watched the flames dance, as if both were trying to understand how two very different worlds had crossed paths that day. After a while, Lone Hawk broke the silence. "You helped Naya," he said in a soft and steady voice. "For that, my heart is thankful." Jacob nodded, unsure what to say. He wasn't used to praise, especially from strangers. "Anyone would have helped her," he replied quietly, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. Many settlers would have been too afraid, too unsure, or too angry. Lone Hawk looked at him with a small smile. "Not anyone." Jacob didn't argue. Instead, he glanced towards the cabin. "She's sleeping now. She'll heal fine. The cut wasn't too deep." Lone Hawk seemed relieved, though his posture still held the steady strength of a leader. "Naya is important to us. She is young, but she is brave. She should not have been left behind." Jacob nodded. "She said you were close." The warrior's eyes softened, and he gazed toward the hills as if remembering something far away. "She lost her family last winter," he said. "The cold took them. Since then, she has stayed with my sister's family. I have watched her like my own." Jacob felt a quiet ache inside him at the thought. Life on the plains was hard for everyone, settlers, tribes, animals. Loss was familiar, like the wind. "I'm sorry," Jacob murmured, and he meant it. Lone Hawk nodded. Life carries both joy and loss. "We must honor both." Then he looked back at Jacob. "Tonight, we stay here. Tomorrow, when the sun rises, we return home." Jacob didn't expect the next words. "You will come with us." He blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. Me? Yes, Lone Hawk said calmly. The elders want to meet you. They want to understand the man who helped one of our young ones. And there is something else. Jacob waited. They want peace. The word hung in the air, surprising Jacob more than anything else. Peace was something everyone claimed to want, yet somehow it remained hard to find in the wide land between the settlers and the tribes. Too much fear, too many misunderstandings, too many stories passed in anger from one group to the other. Jacob took a deep breath. I want peace too, he said honestly. I don't want trouble with anyone. Lone Hawk smiled slightly. Then tomorrow will be a good day. The two men continued talking for a while, sharing small pieces of their worlds. Jacob learned that Lone Hawk had once traded with settlers and even knew a few English words from long ago. In return, Jacob told him about his ranch, his long days of work, and how he lived alone after his family moved east. When Jacob finally went back inside, Naya opened her eyes slightly. She didn't speak, but when she saw him, she smiled gently before drifting back to sleep. Jacob felt strangely honored by her trust. He blew out the lantern and lay down on the small cot in the corner, though he slept only lightly. The morning came with a bright sun and the soft sound of voices outside. Jacob stepped out and saw the warriors preparing to leave. Naya was sitting on a horse, wrapped in a warm blanket. She looked healthier already. When Lone Hawk saw Jacob, he guided a second horse toward him. Come, he said. It is time. Jacob hesitated only for a moment before climbing on. He knew he might never get such a chance again, to talk with people he had always feared but never understood. The journey to the Comanche camp was long but peaceful. Naya rode close to Lone Hawk, who kept watch over her as if she were his daughter. The warriors rode in calm silence, moving as one. Jacob followed, taking in the vast open land around him. He had lived here for years, yet it felt new from this side of the story. As they reached the camp, Jacob was surprised by how ordinary and warm it felt. Families walked between the teepees, children played near small fires, and elders sat outside weaving or shaping tools. The camp felt alive, not threatening. The elders welcomed Jacob with calm respect. They thanked him for helping Naya and for not reacting in fear when the warriors arrived. They offered him food, water, and a place near the fire. Jacob listened to their stories of seasons, journeys, and struggles. In return, they listened to his stories about ranch life, weather challenges, and lonely nights on the plains. Later, Naya walked up to Jacob. She stood quietly for a moment before speaking softly. "Thank you," she said in her gentle voice. "You saved me." Jacob smiled. "You're strong. You would have made it." She shook her head firmly. "No, you helped. I will remember." Her words touched him more deeply than he expected. Near sunset, Lone Hawk walked with Jacob back toward the horses. "You can return home now," he said. "The elders are pleased. They want you to know that you are welcome here. Not many settlers have such an honor." Jacob felt humbled. "Tell them I am thankful." He began his ride back toward his ranch, the sky burning orange and pink behind him. As he looked back one last time, he saw Naya and Lone Hawk watching from the hillside, their figures calm and strong. When Jacob reached his ranch, the land looked the same, but he felt different. Something inside him had shifted, as if a heavy weight he didn't even know he carried had finally lifted. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel alone on the vast plains. Days turned into weeks, and peace settled quietly into Jacob's life. Sometimes he would see Lone Hawk's warriors riding in the distance, and they would lift a hand in greeting. Sometimes Naya would leave small gifts near his fence, a carved wooden bird, a bracelet made of colorful beads. a piece of decorated cloth. And Jacob would leave small gifts in return, dried fruit, polished stones, or rope he had made by hand. They never spoke about the day he saved her again. They didn't need to. Their quiet exchange of kindness was enough to remind them that trust could grow even in the hardest places, and that understanding could rise where fear once lived. Jacob often thought back to that moment when he first saw Naya wounded in the grass. It had seemed like trouble at the time, but it had turned into something else, something bigger, something hopeful. In a land known for conflict, a simple act of compassion had opened a new path. A lone rancher and a Comanche girl had crossed each other's lives by chance, yet the result was a gentle peace that touched both communities. And as long as the plains stretched wide and the wind whispered across the grass, their story quietly